I think it is politically very irresponsible to put pressure on young couples to have more children in a high consuming country. Not only environmentally, we know it's not good for women, it's not good necessarily for communities. If you look at the World Economic Forum risk reports, items to do with age structural change or population aging keep popping up. In, I think, 2018, they highlighted that one of the major risks that the globe was going to face was around chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases. In 2019, they talked about, could the world sustain social security? These shouldn't be risks. These are long-term trends that we should have seen coming, and in fact, in many ways, we did see coming decades ago. And this is all about the demographic transition, the simple idea that as you have societies and countries that become more educated, they become economically more developed, so they reduce, first of all, infant mortality, then fertility comes down, populations start to fall and then to massively expand and then to contract and age. And we've seen this happening across the globe. And policymakers should have actually done something about this slightly earlier. It is, I think, quite shocking. Here we are at the beginning of the 21st century. And particularly if we look at economics, we have some major challenges that are facing many countries, in fact, nearly all countries, particularly the high income countries, but also the lower and middle income countries, around pensions and social security. And I know Lord Turner will be talking to you about this later on. About health, how are we going to cope with chronic diseases? What about health and social care? And about productivity, where are the workers going to come from? So these three specific areas, I think, are major challenges that have come out of demographic changes that we really should have seen going forward. So I've done quite a lot around the costs of long-term care. It's very much nation-based, it's very complex. So I'm actually going to talk to you about productivity and work. But I was asked to start with a big overview of what is happening to the world globally. There are lots of myths out there. Hopefully, this audience is fully aware of it, but let's have some big macro views. So I want to start with this, and this is a bog standard population pyramid from 1990, but I think it's a really fascinating one. So typically, this actually goes from birth only to 75. We have men on one side, women on the other. But I want you to look at three things, really. I want you to look at the shape as we go forward. I'm going to take you through several of these. And I want you to look at the base, because the base is where the childbearing is occurring. And you can see that by 1990, most high-income countries, in fact, were at replacement, or in fact, most of them were more or less below replacement. In other words, the babies that were born had a real opportunity of growing up and having long, healthy lives. On either side, you have the purple, which is sub-Saharan Africa. Then you have a big brown, which is South Asia. And then you have the blue, which is East Asia and Pacific. I'm just going to run you through two other pyramids and focus on the shape and on what is happening at the base. So if we move to 2020, which is where we are now, you can see already we have dramatically, in just 30 years, moved from a global pyramid more into an upside-down vase shape. And by the time we reach 2050, the shape has changed completely. We will be almost in a box, definitely a very elongated upside-down U. And there's some really key things to look at. So first of all, if we look at childbearing, it shows dramatically how, particularly in East Asia, which is fundamentally China, the blues have dramatically shrunk in their contribution to fertility and the number of babies that are being born. Even South Asia, India, Pakistan, etc., Bangladesh, they have been reduced. But look at the dramatic increase in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa is going to be fueling the population growth across most of the 21st century. But also look at the shape. Remember, we went from a pyramid to this almost box shape. And this means that in those bits that have been added on, we can say that demographically, people are not dying on time. And because they're not dying on time, they are contributing to maximum population growth. So those people who say, we're currently at 7.5 billion, we have to reduce the world's population. Well, across this century, and definitely until 2050, that is not going to be possible because most of those extra people are born. It's just that they won't be dying in the way that they used to die. That's a good thing, but our population is going to increase probably to 9.5, maybe 10, or maybe, as I'll say in a minute, possibly even up to 12, depending what happens in sub-Saharan Africa. So let's look at some of these drivers. This is just a map of the total fertility rate, 2015 to 2020, using UN. And I just want you to look at the yellow and the blue countries. These are countries where women are at near or below replacement. Indeed, in 2/3 of the world's countries now, women are more or less hovering around replacement. And it is really only in sub-Saharan Africa where we still have total fertility rates or childbearing rates of between 4 and 9 that we have these very, very high births. And that really is where I think most people believe the focus should be. And I know you have Elijah coming in at the end to talk about, I think, this, which fantastic to have him on the program. And what I think the big message is that just as women in 2/3 of the world's countries now have been empowered to choose the number of children they would like, so it's important that we enable women across the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to be able to choose the number of children that they would like. I don't want to spend too much time on this because, as I say, I know you have a talk on this at the end. But one of the things, I just want to show you this because there's a big debate about, is it family planning, is it health, is it education? And this is a piece of what we did sometime, and I think it really, really shows the relationship between education and family planning. This was produced by Wolfgang Lutz, who was one of the visiting fellows at my institute in Oxford. And if you look, this is 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, and Benin. And we've got along the x-axis, no education, primary and completed. Along the top, we have people who have used contraception, who know about contraception, that's the greeny lines, and then the pinky lines are people who've ever used it. And you can see really clearly that knowledge of contraception is very widespread, but it's the ability of women to be able to use contraception that has this amazing association with education. And there are numerous graphs that we could have produced to show this. So educating women and girls is absolutely vital if we want to enable women to choose the number of children that they can have. What about mortality? What's happening at the other end? This is where we just very simply mapped using UN figures, the percentage aged 60 years or over by the middle of the century. And if you can look at the red, blue and green countries, those countries will have more than 1/5, more than 1/4 and more than 1/3 of their population aged over 60 by 2050. I'm quite gaily bandering around things like 60, 65, 15. These are contested, and you will see in a minute why I will then question them. What about the future? I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we haven't really got that much time, but there obviously is a huge debate about, is life expectancy actually pausing or even falling? There's a lot of work in high-income countries, particularly in the States and here in the UK, looking at inequalities. We now know that actually in these countries, probably due to inequalities within our society, at the lower levels, men are actually stalling and women are falling, and at such numbers that both in the UK and the US, they're bringing down the national projections for life expectancy. Huge amount of work on COVID, and again on the panel I can talk about it, but there isn't really time here. But let's just look at 2 studies that are looking really far forward. This was a study that was published in The Lancet in 2017, and I think caused quite a stir, particularly among demographers. They were using probabilistic modelling of WHO, and they are projecting life expectancy at birth by 2030. And if we zoom forward, we can see what are those top 10 countries. South Korea, France, Japan, Spain, they're the countries that have the highest life expectancy at birth, at age 60 and at age 80 at the population level currently. And this is really important because this says that by 2030, women at birth in South Korea will have a life expectancy of over 90. That's, half the population at birth is going to make it to over 90. And demographers really never thought that would happen so quickly. Another study, this comes from the Human Mortality Database, also published in The Lancet, and this did some slightly different modelling, and they looked at the oldest age at which at least 50% of a birth cohort would be alive, and they suggested that the 2007 birth cohort in Japan, half of them will make it to 107, and in France and the US and Italy, 104, in the UK, 103. So these are big picture projections, but I think we still do believe that actually life expectancy at the population level is likely to continue despite the challenges that the 21st century is throwing at it. What about the implications of this? I did something called the Oxford London Lecture sponsored by The Guardian, and I called it the 21st century, the last century of youth. And we did some quite fun sort of graphic modelling just to show this. And I just want to take you through a couple of these. So one of the things we did was look using UN data, the percentage of children that were going to be in the population across the coming century. So I'm just going to pick up the first one. This is in 1980. And you really need to look at red, because red means that less than 15% of that population were children, all the way up to obviously many of the middle and lower and middle income countries in 1980, which are the yellow, but also the pale blue in particular, where they had over a fifth and over a quarter of their population just aged between 5 and 14. And we know that if we were to take some specific countries, for example, Afghanistan and Pakistan, we have nearly half the population there at that time was under 14. And if we run it forward, look at what happens to the red as we go along. So 1990, 2000, 2010, 2030, children are beginning to vanish from the planet. And by the end of this century, the projections suggest that the vast, in fact, almost the entire world has very few children left, less than 15%. This is what is going to happen across the 21st century. So what are the implications then for the number of workers, or the percentage of workers we're going to have on the planet? And again, just some fun pushing forward on the slides here. What this is, a yellow will pop up, and that means that over 70% of those countries' populations are of working age. Again, this is very contested because we know that as we have, particularly within high-income countries, as we educate, young people don't enter the labour market at 15, and we increasingly know that older adults do not leave at 64. But let's just keep that for some kind of consistency. So if we move forward, interestingly, of course, sub-Saharan Africa had few workers because they had so many children. And you can see here we have over 70% in 2010 in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. But as we go forward, we can see the blue starts to be replaced again by the red. So by the end of the century, we have a dramatic fall in people of this age, which we currently define as workers. So the working population becomes increasingly a less high percentage of our population going forward. So what does this mean? This is some modelling that was done by the OECD, and what it pointed out is that the OECD was facing a dramatic decline in workers, of people of working age, from 2017, and that unless countries were prepared to do something about it, not only would they have a declining population, but they also would have a declining workforce. And what has happened here, as you can see there, they've just simply modelled incoming, that's the blue line, and that's people they defined as 20 to 24. And you can see how it was about 2017, it flipped. And outgoing, which they defined as people 60 to 64. And unless countries put policy in place, the demographics were going to lead to a fall in particularly skills, but also in workers within OECD countries. So how can we have policy levers which might want to ameliorate this? And I'm just going to very quickly go through 4 of them. These are demographic levers. They obviously have socioeconomic implications, and they can be used by government or they can be ignored. A really big one, probably from a demographic point of view, is migration. Migration is the big population balancing act that should, in theory, balance out those young, high-growing countries of the South with the aging, slow-growing or even declining in terms of population countries of the Northern Hemisphere. And indeed, over the last 50 to 70 years, that is what high-income countries have done. So here in Europe and in North America, we have exported economic capital to the countries of the South, the lower and middle income countries, and we have imported human capital, which have boosted our labour markets. And that is a natural thing to occur demographically, and it should, in theory, pan out across to the end of the 21st century, when we believe, in theory, the whole world will be more or less at replacement. But of course, countries intervene, and we only have to look at our own country that has really brought the curtains down on migration. And people are beginning to bandy around the fact that, of course, you know, Britain has an aging population, we've got to do something about it. Well, actually, we were doing something about it, and it was called immigration. And maybe many people will argue that at the social, local level, there are cultural and economic tensions that have to be enacted. But if you look at the countries in Europe that were the most successful in stopping their countries aging, it was the UK and France. And that is because we had a very, very good way of supplementing the fact that we've not replaced ourselves in this country since 1976. We can come back to this, but this demographically is probably the major answer for how to cope with this age structural change. Or we could increase childbearing. Now, before having said I'm just going to talk demographically, I want to just very quickly make the point that actually I think there are all sorts of social, cultural issues, environmental issues about the push of some countries, and these are high-income countries, and we've recently heard about China, who are trying to encourage women to have more children. Before we look at the demographic argument, let's just highlight some of those other negatives. And the one that I know people at this conference are particularly fully aware of is the sustainability of our planet. And I know you have a talk on the finite planet. Our planet simply cannot continue to have huge childbearing, particularly from high-income, high-consuming countries. And I think it is politically very irresponsible to put pressure on young couples to have more children in a high-consuming country. Not only environmentally, we know it's not good for women, it's not good necessarily for communities. Demographically, it really doesn't make sense. I'm very concerned that China is suggesting that women should go on and have 2 or 3 children. If you look at why they introduced the one-child policy between 1979 and 1981, it's because their dependency ratio of children was so high. There were roughly 70 children to every 100 workers in the 1970s in China. And they managed to bring that down so it hit about 40. And with their aging population, they will only go to about 50, 55. So if they are then going to increase the number of children, given that it will take 20 years at least before these young children become workers, they're going to dramatically increase their total dependency ratio. So increasing fertility or childbearing simply doesn't cope with the fact that the demographic transition is natural and it's going to occur across the 21st century. And we might as well look at other ways of coping with it and welcome it, because it will reduce global population. Now, I think you can also say this is very yesterday's thinking. The idea that a country has to increase its population in order to increase its productivity and its consumption, that's yesterday's thinking. Because of this, we obviously have technology, and if we are concerned about jobs and skills, etc., we know that automation, if anything, is going to take away jobs, and this probably is the way that we should be thinking. And just a very quick story about this. This is the BMW Mini factory in Cowley. And there's a really nice story. When I was doing the Prime Minister's review, we went and visited the factory. And they had a problem with an aging workforce. Their Cowley workers were getting older. Many of their workers who were on the factory floor were in their 50s. They simply couldn't do the physical work as they headed into their late 50s and early 60s. So they automated, and they automated because for all sorts of reasons, but one of the byproducts they then discovered was that they could retain their workers. And if you go there, you have men well into their 60s on computers, because it's very able. An older person can definitely operate computers, can learn how to use technology, and the automation does the heavy lifting, so to speak. Colleagues of mine, I'm sure you saw this came out in 2013, Osborne and Frey from Oxford did this wonderful analysis, and do look at it if you haven't seen it, looking at the probability of computerization. And they looked at low probability versus high probability, and they also compared it among jobs, and nearly 50% of jobs, the kind of jobs we'd all be aware of, office, construction, repair, transport, are very, very vulnerable to computerization. That means, if anything, that one can say that the migration story could be supplemented, and I think this is one of the ways our current government is thinking, by moving us very quickly into a very high-tech situation. But it then does mean that we've obviously got to increase the skills so that those jobs that are not so vulnerable, particularly around management and science, and a lot of those sort of lateral thinking jobs, which will take some time before they will be computerized. And then finally, what we can do is increase productivity. And there are lots of different ways we can increase productivity, and I'm sure Lord Turner's going to talk a bit about this, but of course we can work longer. This is some things that came out in The Guardian in 2017, and the second story, Hard Brexit Means Retiring Later, Britain's Warned. We did some modelling for The Guardian, and at that time we thought this was impossible, but we showed that if our country was to have a really hard Brexit and just bring down the shutters, then everybody in this country would have to work another 18 months in order to compensate for the lack of migrant labour coming in. I don't think any of us envisaged what we are seeing at the moment, but that is what the modelling said. Before I move on, let's just quickly put those two stories together, the technology story and this story, because I think one of the things that we are really aware of increasingly is the mental capacity of older adults, and our understanding has increased tremendously over the last couple of decades. And I was part of a panel in Canberra talking to the Treasury with a colleague from the University of Sydney, looking at the difference between fluid intelligence, that's the intelligence you have when you're young, it's very quick, smart, snappy ways of thinking, and what we call crystallized intelligence. It starts really in your 40s and peaks in your 50s and 60s and 70s, and that's around lateral thinking, creativity, being able to think outside the box. We know that AI is very good, and computerization, etc., very good at the first, less good at the second. So we're going to have far more older adults in our workplaces, and they are actually, if we can skill them and train them and keep those skills up, they will be able to take those jobs that computers and AI are finding difficult at the moment. But coming to a close, this is obviously the really big question, because I haven't talked about health at all. There isn't time. In order for this story to occur, that we reduce migrants, we increase our use of technology, we increase older workers, we've got to have a healthy population. And we do know that life expectancy and healthy life expectancy across the globe, not just here in the UK and in the US, is really, to a certain extent, not keeping pace. If anything, life expectancy is not being kept up to by healthy life expectancy. Very briefly, this was some modelling again that I did, or my team did, when we were doing the foresight review for the government using ONS material. And the way you interpret that is that at one side, which is marked 1, 2, 3, they're the most deprived areas in England. 8, 9, 10 are the least deprived or the most affluent, and we're comparing for men aged 65 life expectancy, which is turquoise, and healthy life expectancy, which is green. And what this is saying is, if you live in one of our most deprived areas, a 65-year-old man can expect to make it to 80, but all his 70s will be in ill health. If you live in one of our more affluent areas, a 65-year-old man will make it to his late 80s, and he will not go into ill health until he reaches 80. So unless we can do something about keeping healthy life expectancy, the good story about productivity and older workers will not be achieved. So let's just conclude by raising a few questions that maybe we can pick up in the panel if people are interested. Mortality. What are the big questions around mortality and aging populations? Will increases in life expectancy continue? Will advances in life expectancy be matched by advances in healthy life expectancy? This 3 is really important. Even with advances in healthy life expectancy, will increases in the number of older adults with increased morbidity or ill health within the population? And all the modelling we're doing is saying, sadly, the sheer numbers of older adults is going to increase health, even if we can push back the onset of disability and increase healthy life expectancy. And finally, what is going to be the pace and the trend across the globe and variation within countries and regions? I think demographers often get trends right. They quite often get the pace wrong. Fertility. Will global declines in childbearing continue? That's not clear, I have to say. Will traditional drivers of reducing childbearing around health, education and family planning continue in the still high fertility areas? And I have a paper with a colleague that's just come out in +1, which is really questioning things like desired family size among educated women in sub-Saharan Africa, because they still seem to be very high compared to other regions of the world at the same stage of the fertility transition. How will the new drivers, that's the economic drivers, the cultural drivers, drivers of personal choice, which we see emerging in low fertility, high income countries, play out? And again, pace and trend across the globe. And finally, when we look at migration, I think there is one really big issue. What is going to be the interaction of global drivers? Because population aging is not happening in isolation. That is inequality within our regions, environmental change and civil strife. How is that going to interact with national policies that are actually preventing what one could say is a perfectly natural demographic balancing act? To conclude, this is a book. I wrote a book in 2006 called Aging Societies, Myths, Challenges and Opportunities, and it's just redone it, and it's coming out next year. And what I'm really interested in is how can we ensure resilient individuals and resilient societies in the light of individual and population aging, because this is something that we should have seen and we should not now be running to try to catch up. So thank you.